What's up, you guys? This is Devin with CFXTV Studios, back with another video, and today I am excited because I'm teaching you guys my 3 clicks method of how to get the correct exposure in camera. This is also a great way of learning how exposure is done within the camera itself. Now, the first thing we need to understand is what a stop is, if we don't already know. Now, for those of us who do not know what a stop is a unit of measurement of exposure value in your camera. Stops are measured in shutter speed, stops are measured in aperture, and stops are measured in ISO. This is very important for you guys to know when it comes to learning the 3-click method of gaining the correct exposure. Much like miles when it comes to distance or kilometers, depending on where you are in the world, miles are a unit of measurement of distance, just like kilometers are a unit of measurement of distance, just like stops are a unit of measurement of exposure. So you might be saying to yourself, well, how much is a stop? Well, a stop is a doubling if you're adding light, or it's a halving if you're subtracting light. So if you doubled your exposure from your original exposure, that means you went up a stop. And if you decrease your exposure by half, that means you went down a stop. It's that simple. Now, this is an extremely important factor right here, and it's gonna sound crazy, but stops are actually measured in thirds in the majority of the cameras that you have. You might be saying, in thirds? What do you mean? This is math? What does exposure have to do with math? What does what I see in my camera have to do specifically with math, especially for us beginners? It boggles our minds to know that math can be attributed to what we see and how much of what we see in our images. The ratio of light can be measured in actually fractions. So that means we have to go back to elementary school and understand what thirds are, and essentially all you need to understand is that you have 1/3, you have 2/3, and you have 3/3. 3/3 equals what? A whole. A whole what, you might ask? A whole stop. So let's go back to our cameras, and we might see it a little bit differently than we saw it before. Now look at our exposure meter, that meter in the center of your camera or the center of your screen most of the time on most cameras, or if you're looking in your electronic viewfinder or your eyepiece or your optical viewfinder, you might actually find it right under at the bottom of the screen, right under everything. Now this is a little meter that goes in the middle. It has 0. On one side it has -1, -2, -3, so on and so forth. On the other side it'll have +1, +2, +3. Between each whole number marking there is like 2 little dashes. Those are your third stop increments, right? You have 1/3, 2/3, and then you have 1. You have 1/3, 2/3, and then you have 2, so on and so forth in the positive and negative direction. Now we can take this whole knowledge of stops that we just gained and we can apply it to our exposure meter. Now your camera is always going to try to give you what it thinks to be the correct exposure, and even if you're not all the way in the ballpark, it's going to get you extremely close. Even though computers are not all that great, it's going to get you closer than most people when they first start. Now, when you're looking at the screen, you want to be able to track exposure. This is extremely important because exposure changes no matter where we are. Now, also, we need to understand that because we need to offer certain amounts of exposure to certain settings. We might want to offer a little bit more light to shutter speed. We might want to offer a little bit more light to aperture. So now that we know how our exposure meter is actually set up, we can actually easily go through each number value and get the exact exposure that we want. If we want 1/3 of a stop underexposed, we can get that. If we want 1/3 of a stop overexposed, we can get that as well. All right, so now that we know about stops and how the exposure meter actually works, we can understand what the 3 clicks method is actually about. Now, it's pretty straightforward. It's 3 clicks. Literally pretty much every dial that you have on your camera, the ones that rotate from here to here or go in a circle, they click. They don't just spin smoothly, they click, and they click for a reason. The manufacturer knows that over time, even in the film days, we've been accustomed to these clicks to help us understand where we are as far as how much exposure we're changing over time. All right, now let's go back to our cameras and understand that we have many dials on a camera, but there's 2 main dials usually on all cameras that rotate. These rotating dials can be found on the front. These rotating dials can also be found on the back if you're using Canon cameras mainly, but they Both do the same function. Now you can change them, but they usually apply to your shutter speed, aperture, or ISO. And they always click. Why? They always click because manufacturers know over time that we've been adjusting our exposures, and we've known that tactile clicking helps us get the correct, accurate exposure. So what does the 3 clicks come into play? Well, we already know that the rotary dials click when they move. They click on purpose. They don't click. They don't move smoothly like a dial on your car might move. They move very methodically, and they click and they stop. They click and they stop. That's because they want us to have the most accurate exposure and the most memory feel for getting your accurate exposure. The 3 thing obviously relates to the thirds, of course, because if you move 1 click in either direction, you're moving 1/3 of a stop. Whether it be taking away 1/3, whether it be gaining 1/3. If you move 2 clicks, you're adding or subtracting 2/3. And if you move 3 clicks, you have now moved a stop of exposure. Now you might be saying to yourself, well, that's good and everything, but what am I actually adjusting? It could be shutter speed, it could be ISO, it could be aperture. But whatever you're adjusting, you have to understand that, of course, all 3 of these things are dependent on each other within the exposure triangle. So if you move your ISO a stop, well, that stop has to be gained somewhere or subtracted somewhere depending on what situation you're in. So if you're down a stop, you might add a stop via ISO. So if, say for example, we're at ISO 100, we'll go 3 clicks up and you'll get to 200. If you're down a stop in, let's say, aperture, and you're at f4, you might go up a stop to 2.8 with 3 clicks. Now, believe it or not, shutter speed is the exact same way. Say, for example, we're at 1/100th of a second and we needed 1 more stop of exposure. Well, let's take this in thirds. Going from 1/100th of a second to about 1/80th of a second is 1/3 of a stop. Going from 1/80th to 1/60th of a second, that is 1/3 of a stop. And then going from 1/60th of a second to 1/50th of a second, that is a whole stop from 1/100th of a second. Now, with all that being said, guys, exposure is exactly the same as it's always been. It's just like an equilateral triangle. It's the exposure triangle. So that means whatever you do to one setting, you're gonna have to equivocate on the other 2 settings. So if I change a stop of exposure from shutter speed, it's going to affect my f-stop, and it's also going to affect my ISO. So when it comes to the 3 clicks method, all you're going to have to do is remember how many clicks you took from one setting and apply it to the next setting. If I took 3 clicks or 1 stop from shutter speed and I want to add it to my aperture, then all I have to do is remember how many clicks I took from that one setting and add it to that other setting. It makes it that simple, guys. I'm Devin with CFXTV Studios, guys. I hope this helped translating all that math from a visual to something that you can use in a practical application situation, which is pretty much all the time when we have our cameras. We don't really think math all that much. We think about what's going to look good and what's going to get us a great image. But this is just some practical application that should help you on your journey to getting the great image that you want. Stay tuned for the next episode.